We're on the bottom of Ayin Beis Amud Beis, and we had a discussion in the Gemara regarding a machlokus between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. So it's not going to get that complicated yet. Sorry, Ayin Aleph Amud Beis. My apologies. Ayin Aleph Amud Beis. The Gemara had discussed a machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. The issue is where a person eats two kezayises, two kezesim of chaylev, behelam echad, in one lapse. But the discovery of the eating of those two kezesim of chaylev happens separately. He first discovers that he ate kezayis A, and then realizes he has to bring a carbon. Then, at some point later, he discovers that he ate kezayis B. According to Rabbi Yochanan, he has to bring two separate karbanos. According to Reish Lakish, since the commission was done behelam echad, even though the yediyah was separate, he only has to bring one carbon. The Gemara had brought a pasuk to support Rabbi Yochanan, and had brought it a pasuk to support Reish Lakish. And then the Gemara had said, what is Reish Lakish going to do with Rabbi Yochanan's pasuk? And the Gemara had also explained what Rabbi Yochanan is going to do with Reish Lakish's pasuk. That describes the structure. Now the Gemara raises a question, and this is what we're up to. And we had begun this. The Ravina had posed the question to Rav Ashi: is to what extent do Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish argue? Or phrased differently, what is the scope of the machlokas? There are three ways to look at this machlokas. Do they only argue when there was discovery of the sin, the two kezesim, but there was no action taken, there was no hafrasha of the animal, and therefore, according to Rabbi Yochanan, mental discovery, even without action, is sufficient to make you chayiv for two karbanos, whereas according to Reish Lakish, mental discovery without physical hafrasha is not enough. But Reish Lakish would agree that if there was also physical hafrasha, meaning after I discover that I ate chaylev, kezayis A of chaylev, I take my animal and I designate it as a carbon, and then I discover that I ate kezayis B, even Reish Lakish would agree that since I was mafresh my animal before my discovery of kezayis B, I'm going to be chayiv to separate another carbon. That's one way of looking at the machlokas. Or no, it could be that the other way of looking at the machlokas is that no, even Rabbi Yochanan would agree that mental discovery alone without a physical act is not enough to make me chayiv for two separate karbanos. And the only time that they argue is when I have a physical hafrasha. There, Rabbi Yochanan holds that physical hafrasha together with my discovery is enough to make me chayiv twice. And Reish Lakish says no, it's only after you've actually brought the carbon after the discovery. That you'd have to be chayiv twice. But if you just designated the animal, that's not enough to make you chayiv twice. You're only going to be chayiv once. That's the second way of looking at the machlokas. The third way of looking at the machlokas is that the scope encompasses both possibilities. That Rabbi Yochanan is so machmir to be mechayiv me twice, that even mental discovery alone will make me chayiv two karbanos, and Reish Lakish will be of the opinion that not only does mental discovery not make you chayiv twice, but even if you're mafresh the animal, you're not going to be chayiv twice. And the only time, according to Reish Lakish, that you'll be chayiv twice is if you actually brought the animal as a carbon in order to receive the kapara for kezayis A, and only afterwards you discover that you ate kezayis B. So those are the three possibilities that we left off with in the Gemara yesterday, and now the Gemara is going to try and clarify. So Rav Ashi, after hearing Ravina's shaila, Amar Lei, and this is the last of the thin lines on Daf Ayin Aleph Amud Beis, Amar Lei mistavra vein bezu machlokas. It would seem to me that the machlokas of Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan, the scope of that machlokas is in all cases, both when you have only mental discovery and when you're mafresh the animal. In both cases, Rabbi Yochanan says you're chayiv twice, and in both cases, Reish Lakish says you're only chayiv one. The Isal Gedaitich Kodem Hafrasha Pligi Volacher Hafrasha Modele Reish Lakish Rabbi Yochanan Dechayv Shtayim. Because if you're going to think that the only time that there's a machlokus is when you've actually is only when you had a mental discovery, in which case Rabbi Yochanan says you're chayiv twice and Reish Lakish says you're only chayiv one. But in a case where you were actually mafresh the animal, both Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan agree that you're chayiv two animals. Ademukim leikra la'achar kapara lukme la'achar hafrasha. Well, then I have a question. Why is it that when we were trying to explain what Reish Lakish is going to do with Rabbi Yochanan's pasuk, Rabbi Yochanan's pasuk had indicated that you're chayiv for each and every avera, so that you can be chayiv multiple karbanos. So the Gemara had said, what is Reish Lakish going to do with Rabbi Yochanan's pasuk? And the Gemara answered yesterday, well, he'll tell you that pasuk that says that you're chayiv for each and every avera, for each and every commission, is talking about if you brought a carbon after the first commission before you discovered the second commission. Well, why did the Gemara have to say that? The Gemara should have just said that we're talking about a case where you were mafresh the animal after discovery of the first commission before you discovered the second commission. The fact that the Gemara doesn't say that indicates that Reish Lakish disagrees even in a case of where you were mafresh the animal. The achar hafrasha pligi abal kodem hafrasha modi le Rabbi Yochanan le Reish Lakish deinu chayav ela echas. And let's look at it from the other side, says the Gemara. If the machlokes is only after you're mafresh the behema, where Rabbi Yochanan says you're chayiv twice because you were already mafresh the behema before discovery of Kazayas B, and Reish Lakish says no, that since you were mafresh the animal, that's not enough to make you chayiv twice. But if it's before hafrasha, if it's just a mental discovery, even Rabbi Yochanan agrees that you're only going to be chayiv once. So the Gemara then says, well, then why, when the Gemara was asking the question, what is Rabbi Yochanan going to do with Reish Lakish's pasuk? Reish Lakish had introduced a pasuk that seemed to imply that you only need one kapara for multiple commissions. And the Gemara had said, what is Rabbi Yochanan going to do with that pasuk? So the Gemara had answered, it's addressing this very strange case, which we won't go into detail anymore today, but where you ate 1.5 kazesim at one sitting, and a half a kazayas at a second sitting, and the chiddush of that pasuk is that you're not going to be chayiv for the second kazayas. Even though you only discovered that you ate one kazayas first, you're not going to be chayiv for that second kazayas. That's what Rabbi Yochanan says you need the pasuk for that strange case. Well, why did you have to tell me that? Why couldn't you just answer that when according to Rabbi Yochanan, when the Torah says that you only have to bring one carbon for multiple commissions, it's talking about where you only had a mental discovery between Kazayas A and Kazayas B, because there Rabbi Yochanan agrees that you're only chayiv one carbon for multiple commissions. The fact that the Gemara doesn't do that indicates that Rabbi Yochanan says even when there's only mental discovery between Kazayas A and Kazayas B, you're chayiv two karbanos. So the Gemara says, no, we don't accept Rav Ashi, your proof, from the previous discussion of what Rabbi Yochanan does with Rabbi Reish Lakish's pasuk and what Reish Lakish does with Rabbi Yochanan's pasuk, because the dilma safuki misafkile ve'imtim salomar ka'amar, because maybe the people in the Beis Medrash who were trying to analyze the machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish weren't sure to what extent they argue, and therefore they were trying to cover all their bases. Is basically what the Gemara is saying. That imtim salomar kodam hafrasha pligiba Rabbi Yochanan heichi mukila likra because aisu mechza v'imtim salomar la'acha hafrasha pligi Reish Lakish heichi mukila likra bila achar kapara. And basically, what the rabbis in the Beis Medrash who were analyzing this machlokus were saying is, look, we're not sure to what extent Rabbi Yochanan holds you have to bring two separate karbanos. But even if you're going to say that he requires two karbanos, even if Kazayas A and Kazayas B are only divided by mental discovery, then, and even if Rabbi Yochanan holds you have to bring two karbanos in that situation, then what is he going to do with Reish Lakish's pasuk, which implies you only have to bring one carbon? So they said, well, in that instance, I'll have to say that the pasuk is talking about that strange case of where he ate 1.5 kazesim followed by another sitting of eating a half a kazayas. And the flip side as well. We're not really sure to what extent Reish Lakish will let you off the hook with only one carbon. It could be that he'll even let you off the hook even after you were mafresh the animal after your discovery of Kazayas A. And in that case, then what is he going to do with Rabbi Yochanan's pasuk? So I'll have to tell you that Rabbi Yochanan's pasuk is talking about we already received the kapara. But you can't prove from that discussion of the psukim what in reality Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish argue about, because the people in the Beis Medrash who were discussing their machlokas themselves were uncertain. That's the conclusion of the Gemara, that we have no resolution to what the scope of this machlokas is all about. Now we go weiter. That was the easy part of the Gemara today. Let's go on. Omar Ula. Ula now says, Leman da Omar Asham Vade Lo Bayi Yediya Batchila. Now, in order to understand this line of Gemara, we need a little bit of an introduction. Up until now, we've learned about bringing a korban for committing an act for which the punishment is kares if you do it b'mezid. So if you commit it b'shogeg, you have to bring a korban chatas. That's a female animal, it's a female sheep, and you bring it to atone for your commission b'shogeg. There's another type of korban called a korban asham. And a korban asham, there are 4 different kinds of korban asham, which we're going to detail for you now. You only have to remember really 2 out of the 4, because there's 2 types, but there's 4 in total. The one type is called an asham talui, which means that if I'm not sure that I've eaten chaylev or not, I can't bring a korban chatas, because I don't know for sure that I've committed a sin. So what I do instead is I bring what's called an asham talui. I bring a different animal. This is now a he-goat. I bring a he-goat to atone for the possibility that I may have sinned. If later on I discover that I for sure sinned, I for sure ate the chaylev, then I have to bring a korban chatas in addition to the korban asham talui that I previously brought. That's the din of an asham talui. The other type of asham is called an asham vadai. An asham vadai occurs in 3 cases, where the way to atone for that sin is to bring a he-goat when I know for sure that I've committed the sin. The only 3 cases in the Torah that prescribe an asham vadai are asham me'ilah, where I have violated temple property for self-consumption. Number 2, when I have stolen and I swear falsely denying that I haven't stolen in court. And number 3, when I have relations with a woman called a shifcha charufa, which is a very obscure case, but it's a woman that I'm not allowed to have relations with because she's neither free completely nor she is indentured completely. She's half free and half indentured, so she's off limits. And the Torah says that if you have relations with her, you have to bring something called a korban asham vadai. So in all of those 3 cases, now that we know there's 2 different kinds of asham, there's an asham talui and an asham vadai. An asham for a maybe sin, and an asham for a for sure sin, which is only in 3 cases in the entire Torah. The question now comes up. It's a machlokus between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon. What happens if a person is not sure that he has done an act of me'ilah? I'm not sure if I have ingested or utilized temple property. So Rabbi Akiva is of the opinion, bring an asham talui now, and if you discover, because you're not sure, and if later on you discover that you really did for sure violate temple property, then you have to bring an asham vadai. Now the reason why Rabbi Akiva is of this opinion is because Rabbi Akiva says that you need to have yediyah, you need to have absolute certainty and knowledge in order to be able to bring an asham vadai for an act of me'ilah. But Rabbi Tarfon disagrees. Rabbi Tarfon says, look, let's think about this. The animal is the same, the korban is the same, whether it's an asham talui or an asham vadai. So when you're not sure whether you did an act of me'ilah, think about it this way. Say, look, right now I don't know what I did, so I'll bring an asham talui, but I'll have also in mind that if later on I discover that this is I for sure did an act of me'ilah, off with the phones. If I know for sure that I did an act of me'ilah, then I want this to count as my asham vadai as well. And Rabbi Tarfon says that's legitimate. So even if later on you discover that for sure you did an act of me'ilah, the carbon that you brought as your asham taloi can also count as your asham vadai, and you'll only have had to bring one animal. The difference of opinion between Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva is simply this: do you need to have yediyah in order to bring an asham vadai or not? Do you have to have absolute knowledge and absolute certainty in order to be qualified to bring an asham vadai? Rabbi Akiva says yes, and therefore when you're not sure, this carbon can't count as an asham vadai. And Rabbi Tarfon says no. Rabbi Tarfon says you don't have to have absolute knowledge. And that's the vital difference for Rabbi Tarfon between a carbon chatas and a carbon asham. For everyone agrees that in order to be able to bring a carbon chatas, you have to have absolute certainty that you committed the avera. And therefore, if you bring an asham, since it's a totally different animal, and you didn't have absolute certainty whether you did it or not, just bringing the carbon asham taloi is not going to cover your later having to bring a carbon chatas. So Rabbi Tarfon says that since you don't need that knowledge before bringing an asham vadai, you can bring an asham taloi with the intention that if I later discover that I for sure did the avera, then I want this to count as my asham vadai as well.
Next question
I only want to take questions if they're specifically relevant to an understanding of the Gemara.
It is.
Okay.
So asham vadai, you know you did a savera?
Yes.
So how can you bring a carbon if you know for sure you made it? Because I guess that's what the Torah says.
There are two different kinds of ashams in the Torah: an asham taloi and an asham vadai. So an asham vadai is what is like a carbon chatas, where you know. Got it? Okay. Good. All right. So now, according to Rebbe Tarfon, so the Gemara now says like this: Leman da Amar asham vadai lo baya yediyah batchila. If you hold like Rebbe Tarfon, who says that in order to bring an asham vadai, you don't need to have absolute knowledge of whether or not you did the avera. So therefore, just keep in mind in a generic sense, knowledge or discovery is not significant vis-a-vis a carbon asham. It's significant for a chatas, but it's not significant for an asham. So my question therefore is as follows: Bo'al chamesh be'ilos b'shivcha charufa eino chayev ela echas. Then if a person b'shogeg has relations with the shivcha charufa 5 different times, so then even if there's discovery that's done in between each be'ila, he's only going to be chayev 1 carbon. Now normally, when I do an act for which I have to bring a carbon chatas, if I have discovery in between each forbidden commission, I have to bring multiple karbanos. But since knowledge or discovery is not significant by a carbon asham, then even if I have discovery in between each commission, I'm only going to have to bring 1 carbon at the end of the day. And similarly, as it relates to our Gemara now here, if I commit all 5 be'ilos, all 5 forbidden encounters, behelam echad, and then I have separate discoveries afterwards, that's irrelevant. It's going to be irrelevant even according to Rabbi Yochanan, who says that separate discoveries do make a difference. But over here, because we're dealing with a carbon asham, separate discoveries are going to be completely irrelevant. And therefore you'll be able to get off the hook with only 1 carbon. So maskif la Rav Hamnuna ela me'ata. So Rav Hamnuna says, well, I don't understand what you're saying. He says, according to that argument, Baal v'chazaru Baal v'hifresh karban v'amar hamtinu liyad she'evol hachanami de'eno chayev ela echas. He says, what would happen if a person commits the avera with the shivcha charufa, and then he sets aside his animal, and then he commits another time b'shogeg with the shivcha charufa, and then he sets aside his animal? Are you going? And then he says, wait, maybe I may do other acts b'shogeg that I'm not aware of in the future. So,
Same animal.
What?
The same animal, the first and second time.
Yeah. So are you telling me basically that he's only going to have to bring 1 animal? Does that make any sense? If he's already set aside the animal, can he use that to count for future shogeg commissions? So the Gemara says, Amar lei maaseh de la'achar hafrasha ka'amart, maaseh de la'achar hafrasha lo ka'amin. So Ula responds back to Rav Hamnuna, and he says, no, come on. When you do a physical act to set aside the animal, so there for sure, you can't say that a future commission can be appended to that korban. And similarly, it would seem that Ula is arguing that a discovery that's accompanied by a hafrasha, by a physical act of segregating the animal, does divide the karbanos, like Rabbi Yochanan and perhaps even Reish Lakish argues. Ki asa Rav Dimi. So now Rav Dimi comes along, and Rav Dimi is actually an agreement with Ula, but he's coming from the opposite direction. Amar, Lamanda Amar Ashram Vadai Boi Yediya Batchila. He says, if you hold like Rabbi Akiva, who holds that even for a korban asham vadai, you need to have absolute knowledge beforehand in order to enable you to bring a korban asham vadai. So, according to him, Bo'al chamesh be'ilos b'shivcha charufa, chayav al kol echas ve'echas. That if a man has relations, according to Rabbi Akiva, knowledge is significant for a korban asham as well as a korban chatas. And therefore, if a person has discovery in between each time he has this encounter with the shivcha charufa, he's going to be chayav a separate korban for each encounter. So Amar le Abaye harei chatas deboin in yediya batchila upligi Rabbi Yochanan Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. So Abaye says back to him, I don't understand why you say that. After all, isn't knowledge significant by a korban chatas? And yet that's still the subject of a machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. So just like Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish disagree about that issue, and even only according to Rabbi Yochanan does discovery obligate you to bring two karbanos, but according to Reish Lakish you can get by with only one karban if you committed the Yisurim Behelam Echad and your discoveries are separate. So you see that works. So why don't you say the same thing by the Shivcha Charufa? Let's say I commit all five Be'ilos, all five encounters Behelam Echad, and my discoveries are separate. Why don't you say also that's a machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish? So Ishtik, so he was silent and he didn't respond. So Amar Lei, so Abaye says to Rav Dimi, Dilma b'maisa de la'acher hafrasha ka'amar tucha de Rav Hamnuna. So Abaye says to him, maybe when you say that absolutely certain, according to Rabbi Akiva, that you're going to have to bring, and this is true even according to Rabbi Tarfa, that you're going to have to bring a separate korban, is because what happens is that after the guy discovers that he was boil shivcha charufa A, he also sets aside an animal. He says, maybe you agree with Rav Hamnuna, who says that once you do a physical act to segregate the animal, then any future be'ilo or any future discovery cannot be appended to that animal. So Amar Lei in. So Rav Dimi says, yes, that's taka what I'm talking about. You're right. And therefore, it'll depend. If there's only a mental discovery, then that'll be a machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. But if there's an actual physical segregation of an animal, a hafrasha, so then, like Rav Hamnuna says, that'll make you obligated to bring a separate animal as a korban, even not only according to Reb Kiva, who says that knowledge is significant, discovery is significant, but even according to Reb Tarfon, who says that knowledge is not significant, but the physical segregation of the animal is significant. Ki asa Rabin Amar hakol moedim b'shivcha charufa, v'akol moedim b'shivcha charufa, u'machlokas b'shivcha charufa. Now, Rabin comes along, and he makes a tripartite statement, which is confusing. He says, point number one, he says, everyone agrees by the law of Shivcha Charufa. Part two, everyone agrees by the law of Shivcha Charufa. And part three, there's a machlokas by the law of Shivcha Charufa. So what does he mean by that? So explains the Gemara. Hakol modem b'Shivcha Charufa de'eno chayav ela echas k'du'ula. When we say that everyone agrees, we're referring to Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. That both Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish agree that when we go in according to the opinion of Rabbi Tarfon, who says that discovery or knowledge is not significant by an Asham Vadai, then everyone would agree that the law by Shivcha Charufa, even though your discoveries are separate, even Rabbi Yochanan would agree that since knowledge is not significant by a korban Asham, you can get by with one korban. Also, when we say everyone agrees, regarding a shivcha charufa that you're going to be chaya for a separate korban for each commission, that's going according to Rav Hamnuna, where you segregated the animal, you did an act of hafrasha after your discovery of shivcha charufa A, then even Rabbi Yochanan will agree that you have to bring a separate korban for each and every commission. And finally, umachlokas b'shivcha charufa lamanda amar asham vaday bo yediya batchila machlokas to Rabbi Yechanan and Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. And finally, the third statement, which was that it's a machlokas regarding the law of shivcha charufa, is going according to Rabbi Akiva, who says that knowledge is significant regarding a korban asham, and therefore, if a person discovers without doing an act of hafrasha, after he discovers he did an act of be'ila with shivcha charufa A, and he hasn't yet segregated his animal, then according to Rabbi Yechanan, you're going to be chayev, because knowledge is significant, discovery is significant, even though there was no physical act of hafrasha. And according to Reish Lakish, since there was no physical act of hafrasha, you can get by with one korban. That'll be the machlokas. So that concludes this discussion. Very confusing. Again, it's criminal to have to go weiter, but we have no choice. Let's go on. Itmar. The next statement of the Gemara. Niskaveng lahagbia es hatolosh v'chosach es hamachuber. Now we're talking about a totally different subject, which is very important. It's the subject of what's called misasek. Up until now, we've been learning about the topic of shogeg, where a person, there's two different kinds of shogeg classically according to the Gemara. You either think that today's not Shabbos, or you're not aware that what you're doing is a malacha. You think that it's permitted to do this on Shabbos. You know it's Shabbos, but you think that it's permitted to do this. But there's a third kind of accidental activity, which is where you're not even aware of what you're doing. Like Rashi explains, a knife falls down in a flower bed or in a vegetable garden, and your thinking is, I'm going to pick up the knife. And accidentally, in the course of picking up the knife, you actually cut a flower. You cut a vegetable while you're picking up the knife. You have no idea. You didn't realize what you were doing. So in that situation, potter. Everyone agrees that what's called being a misasek. You had no intention of cutting the flower, and so therefore that's not even called a shogeg, because you don't even know. You're not even aware of the activity that you're engaging in. However, lachtoch es hatolish v'chosach es hamachuber. But now let's talk about the next case. What if your intention is to cut? But your intention is to cut something which you think is not attached to the ground, which, by the way, is not a malacha. If I take a scissors on Shabbos and I take a pipe cleaner and I cut it clean in half, I haven't done a malacha. It may be an isser derabanan, right? But I haven't done a malacha. So what if I take a knife or a scissors and I see what appears to me to be a cut flower on the ground, and I snip it? And in reality, what has happened is that this is a flower that's growing from the ground. I thought that it was already severed from the ground, and I just cut it in order to trim its long stem. But in reality, it's attached to the ground. So this is less of a misasek because I know what I'm doing, but I don't know. The only lack of awareness that I have is I thought that the object of my action was one thing, and it turns out to be another thing. So there, the Gemara says this is a machlokas. Rava Amar Potter, Abaya Amar Chayiv. Rava says you're still going to be Potter. That's also called a misasek. And Abaya says in that case you're going to be Chayiv. So Rava Amar Potter Deholo Niskavein Lachaticha Diisura. The reason why Rava says you're Potter is because it was never your intention to do a forbidden act of cutting, to cut something that was attached to the ground. Abaya Amar Chayiv Dehakamichavein Lachaticha Ba'alma. And Abaya says, he looks at it as, look, as long as your intention was to cut, and your intention was realized, then you're called a shogeg, and you have to bring a korban chatas. That's not called a misasek anymore. That's called a real shogeg. Amar Rav. So now let's look at Rava's position. Mina aminala. How can I prove to you that what I'm saying is correct, that you're going to be potter? Titania. And we're not going to be able to fully understand Rava's proof, but we're just going to start it today. The Brisa says, Chomer Shabbos Mishar mitzvos, v'chomer shar mitzvos mishabbos. There's a stringency with other mitzvos that does not exist with Shabbos, and there's a stringency with Shabbos that does not exist in other mitzvos. Chomer Shabbos mishar mitzvos. In what respect is Shabbos more stringent than other mitzvos? SHB behelam echad chayev al kol echas ve'echas ma she'en kein bishar mitzvos. that on Shabbos, if you do two forbidden acts with one lapse, but with one helim, so then you're going to be chayiv twice, whereas by other mitzvahs, you're only going to be chayiv once. We'll explain this in a minute. The chomer shar mitzvahs mishabes shabishar mitzvahs shagag below miskavin chayiv ma she'en kein b'Shabbos. And the stringency that exists in other mitzvahs over Shabbos is that with other mitzvahs, if you did an act of shogeg without intention, you're going to be chayiv, which is not true for Shabbos, because with Shabbos, if you do it without any kavana, then you're going to be completely off the hook. So now we have to understand what is going on over here. Amar Mar. Let's go back and analyze this brisa. Chomer Shabbos mishar mitzvahs Shabbos asher shleim behelam echad chayv al kol echas ve'echas mashenkin bishar mitzvahs. That Shabbos is more stringent than other mitzvahs because with Shabbos, if I do multiple commissions, I'm going to be chayiv for each commission, which is not true by other mitzvahs. Hey chidami. So what's the case? Ilay mida'avad kitsira utechina. Because let's see, what's maybe the case by Shabbos where I do multiple commissions, I do separate malachas. I do one act of Ketzira, I do one act of Techina. So I'm chayev a korban chatas for each and every act, like we said before. If it's Zidon Shabbos and Shigagas malachos, I'll be chayev for multiple malachos and I have to bring multiple karbanos. So dekavasa gabi shar mitzvah. So what's the parallel in regard to other mitzvahs? That would be like ochel chelav v'dam. Like if a person eats a kazayas chaylev and then eats a kazayas of dam, he does it behelam echad. So what are you going to tell me that over there I'm only chayiv one korban chatos? Hachatarti michayiv, hachatarti michayiv. In both of those scenarios, you have to bring two korbanos chatos. If I do kitzir and techina behelam echad, I have to bring two korbanos chatos. And if I eat chaylev and dam behelam echad, I have to bring two korbanos chatos as well because they're two separate averos. So ela shar mitzvahs telo michayiv ela chada hechidami. So what's the only way that I can figure out, I can think of a case where I only have to bring one korban for doing two commissions by other mitzvahs, the achal chaylev v'chaylev. I must have eaten two kazesim of chaylev, behelam echad, and therefore I only have to bring one korban chatas. But wait a minute, the kavasa gabe Shabbos lava ketzira ketzira. The parallel case by Shabbos is if I do two of the same malacha. Just like I did two eatings of the same isser of chaylev, I must be doing two of the same malacha. I'm doing two acts of kotzer. If I do two acts of kotzer behelam echad, so hachachada michayiv, hachachada michayiv. So then once again, I'm only chayiv one korban for other mitzvahs, and I'm only chayiv one korban for Shabbos as well. So what is the scenario where by the laws of Shabbos I'm chayiv twice, and by the laws of other mitzvahs I'm only chayiv once? So la'olam da'avad ketzira utechina, umay ma she'en kein b'shar mitzvos avodah zara. So the Gemara's answer is that what we're talking about with Shabbos is I do two separate malachos behelam echad. I do kotzer and I do tochein. And that's not true by other mitzvahs because we're talking about the isser of avodah zarah, of idolatry. The Rabbi Ami, the Amar Rabbi Ami, ziveach v'kiter v'niseich b'halama echas eno chayev ela echas. Because Rabbi Ami says that if I do multiple kinds of idol worship to the same idol, even though I've done an act of sacrifice, I've done an act of incense offering, I've done an act of wine libation, since it's all to the same idolatry, I'm only chayav one korban to atone for my act of idolatry that was done b'shogeg. So there, the Gemara wants to make that distinction between Shabbos and Avodah Zarah, that in one respect, we're more machmir by the laws of Shabbos than even the laws of Avodah Zarah, because potentially by Avodah Zarah you'll be off the hook with one korban, and by Shabbos you have to bring multiple korbanos. Unfortunately, this is as far as we got in the earlier shir, so I'll let Rabbi Torchiner take over from this point. We'll see how this is going to conclude Rava's proof, Mr. Shem, tomorrow. And Mr. Shem, I will see you in 2 weeks. We'll commence with our DAF Yomi, because we'll be in Eretz Yisrael.